Sergeant Rick Donovan snatched the file off the table and threw it across the room. "This is a joke," he snapped loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Someone actually approved a 17-year-old girl for elite sniper evaluation. Who did she sleep with to get clearance?" The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Nobody stopped it. Nobody pushed back. The girl standing just outside the door heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply adjusted the strap on her rifle case and waited. Before we go any further, if this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that desert and let's find out who Hailey Morgan really was. It was Christmas Eve. Not the kind of Christmas Eve most people remember. No warm kitchens, no families gathered around decorated tables, no carols playing softly from a radio in the next room. This was the Nevada desert, and the cold out there was the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. It came down from the sky, climbed up through the ground, and found every gap in your clothing, whether you were ready for it or not. The stars were out in full force that night, bright and indifferent, hanging over a stretch of empty land that felt like the edge of the world. And in the middle of all that emptiness, there was a checkpoint. A single military vehicle sat idling at the outer perimeter of the Ridgecrest Advanced Training Facility, its headlights cutting two pale lines into the darkness ahead. Two soldiers stood outside the vehicle, stamping their boots against the frozen earth, their breath coming out in small clouds that disappeared almost instantly into the night air. Specialist Aaron Briggs had been assigned to checkpoint duty as what his sergeant called character building. Briggs called it something else entirely, but not within earshot of anyone who outranked him. He was 23 years old, 2 tours completed, and he genuinely believed that tonight was going to be the dullest 4 hours of his military career. Then the headlights appeared on the access road. A single vehicle, moving slowly, coming from the direction of the highway, which was itself already 12 miles from anything resembling civilization. "Who the hell is coming out here on Christmas Eve?" his partner specialist Torres muttered. "Probably lost," Briggs said. The vehicle pulled up to the barrier. It was an older model pickup truck, the kind that had clearly been driven hard across a lot of difficult terrain without a lot of maintenance in between. Briggs walked up to the driver's side window, hand resting casually near his sidearm. Not because he was alarmed, but because that was procedure. The window came down. The driver was a girl. She looked young, not young like she was in her early 20s and could pass for a teenager. Young like she was actually still in high school, dark hair pulled back without ceremony, no makeup, no jewelry. A face that was calm in a way that felt deliberately controlled rather than naturally relaxed. She had brown eyes that didn't look away when Briggs leaned forward to get a better look at her. And those eyes were doing something that made Briggs uncomfortable without being able to explain exactly why. They were reading him. Quietly, quickly, taking inventory of everything he was and everything he wasn't, the way experienced people do when they're trying to assess a situation. "ID and authorization," Briggs said. She handed both through the window without a word. Briggs looked at the ID first. Hailey Morgan. Date of birth making her 17 years old. He looked at it twice. Then he looked at the authorization document. His eyes moved across it slowly, and when he got to the classification stamp and the priority notation at the bottom, he stopped. He walked back to Torres. "Call it in," he said quietly. "What's her deal? Just call it in." Torres made the call. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a voice came back, and from the way Torres's expression shifted, whatever that voice said was not what either of them had expected on a quiet Christmas Eve. Torres walked back over to Briggs and kept his voice low. "She's cleared. Priority entry. Master Chief Walker is expecting her." Briggs looked back at the truck, at the girl sitting behind the wheel with her hands resting quietly in her lap, waiting without impatience. Then he looked at the worn duffel bag visible in the back seat, and beside it a hard-shell rifle case that had clearly seen serious use. "She's 17, Briggs said, not to Torres, not to anyone in particular. "Walk her in," Torres said. Briggs opened the barrier. The truck rolled through. And something about the way it moved through that checkpoint quietly without hesitation, without any particular urgency, stayed with Briggs for a long time afterward. He couldn't explain it. He just knew that whatever he'd expected his Christmas Eve to become, it had just changed into something else entirely. Master Chief Daniel Walker was the kind of man who had spent so many years in difficult places that ordinary life had started to feel slightly unreal to him. He was 51 years old, and those years were visible, not in a broken way, in a load-bearing way, like a structure that had been tested and had not come down. He had been a Navy sniper instructor for 11 years, and before that, he had been the thing you became an instructor to teach other people to be. His record was not publicly accessible, and he preferred it that way. He was not a man who needed people to know what he had done. He only needed people to do their jobs correctly and not get themselves or anyone else killed in the process. I was reviewing the week's evaluation schedule when his aide, Petty Officer Second Class, Linda Chen, knocked on the frame of his open office door. "Master Chief, the Morgan girl just cleared the outer perimeter." Walker looked up. He looked down at the thin manila folder on his desk. He had read it 3 times already. Reading it a 4th time wouldn't make it any thicker or any more informative. But he opened it again anyway, the way you reread a sentence that doesn't quite make sense to check whether you misunderstood it the first time. The folder held very little. Name Hailey Morgan, age 17, hometown redacted, prior military experience none, prior civilian shooting experience listed only as extensive non-institutional, references redacted, background redacted, training history redacted. And at the bottom, a clearance notation that should not have existed for someone with this file signed by a name that Walker recognized and which he had not expected to see attached to anything like this. At the very bottom in plain type, approved for advanced sniper evaluation, priority status, do not delay or rewrote. Walker had been in the military long enough to know that files with this many redactions were not empty. They were full of things that someone with significant authority had decided he did not need to know. And priority notation on an evaluation for a 17-year-old civilian was not a routine administrative decision. Somebody had pushed hard for this. Somebody who had enough weight to make the push stick. The question that had been sitting in Walker's mind since the folder arrived 2 days ago was the same question he still hadn't answered. Why he closed the folder. "Send her to the briefing room," he said, "and tell the evaluation team to assemble in 10 minutes. The briefing room was not a place designed for comfort. It was a place designed for focus, which meant it was stripped of everything that wasn't operationally relevant. A long table, chairs that were functional but not forgiving, a large display board at one end, overhead lighting that was bright without warmth. By the time Hailey Morgan walked through the door, there were 8 men already in the room. Not 8 men in the abstract sense. 8 men who had between them accumulated a combined operational experience that covered multiple theaters, multiple decades, and a number of situations that didn't appear in any publicly available documentation. These were people who had been places and done things that most of the population would never know about, and probably couldn't fully comprehend if they did. They had been briefed on the evening's evaluation schedule. They had been told that a new candidate was arriving for assessment. They had not been told the candidate was 17 years old. When Hailey walked in, the room went quiet for exactly 1 second, and then it went loud. Not loud in an organized way. Loud in the way rooms get when a group of people who trust each other completely feel comfortable saying what they're actually thinking out loud because there are no consequences among colleagues. Is she lost? This came from Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, who was sitting back in his chair with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had already decided something before he had all the information. "She's not lost," said Staff Sergeant Joel Watts, and he was grinning, which was worse than being skeptical, because it meant he found the situation funny. "Who's the guardian?" said another voice. "She needs a permission slip to be on base." The laughter that followed was not cruel in a calculated way. It was the laughter of people who were genuinely surprised and hadn't thought through the implication of laughing. It was the kind of reaction that people look back on later when the full picture has come in and feel genuinely uncomfortable about. Hailey stood in the doorway and let it happen. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look angry. She did not look like she was performing a reaction for the benefit of the room. She looked like someone standing in the rain who had left their umbrella at home, not because they'd forgotten it, but because they'd known it was going to rain and had decided they didn't need it. She waited for the noise to settle, then she looked at the room. Not at any one person, at the room, methodically. The way she had looked at Briggs back at the checkpoint cataloging without commentary. Then she said quietly and without any particular emphasis, "Where do I put my gear?" That was it, 5 words. And the room got uncomfortable in a new way. Not the discomfort of surprise, but the discomfort of recognition. Because the men in that room had spent their careers learning to read people quickly and accurately, and what they had just read in those 5 words, in the tone, in the posture, in the complete absence of anything defensive, was something they hadn't expected to encounter. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't bracing for a fight. She was simply ready to work. Marcus Reed uncrossed his arms. Joel Watts stopped grinning. The room didn't know what to do with that, so it did the only thing it could do. It got quiet. Master Chief Walker arrived 4 minutes later. He came into the room, looked at Hailey standing to one side with her bags at her feet, looked at the expression on the faces of his evaluation team, and understood immediately that the first 5 minutes had not gone quietly. I didn't address it directly. He pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat down and looked at the file in front of him, the way he always looked at anything before a briefing, like it owed him clarity and hadn't delivered it yet. "Miss Morgan," he said, "sit down." She sat. "I'm going to be direct with you," Walker said. "This file is the thinnest evaluation authorization I have ever received, and I have been doing this for a long time. What I know about you is your name and your age. What I don't know is considerably more. So before we spend any more time on the evaluation course tonight, I'd like to understand what I'm actually looking at." Hailey looked at him across the table. "What would you like to know?" she said. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question. She was offering him the opening, letting him decide what mattered. Walker leaned back. "How long have you been shooting?" "Since I was 7, she said. Reed made a small sound. Walker didn't look at him. "Competitive?" Walker asked. "Not exactly," she said. "Then what exactly?" There was a pause. Not a nervous pause. A measuring pause. The kind people take when they're deciding not how much to say, but how to say it accurately. "My father taught me," she said. "We didn't do competitions. We did conditions, wind, distance, temperature changes, unknown terrain, moving targets. He said competitions were for showing people what you could do in a controlled environment. He wanted me to be able to do it when the environment wasn't controlled." The room was completely silent now. Walker looked at her steadily. "Who is your father?" She met his eyes. "Captain Michael Morgan." The silence that followed that name was a different kind of silence than anything that had come before it. This silence had weight. It pushed down on the room and changed the temperature of it. Walker's expression did not change. He was too experienced for his face to betray him in front of a room full of people he was responsible for. But something shifted behind his eyes that was there and gone before anyone else could have caught it. He knew that name. He set down the folder. "All right," he said, and his voice was level, professionally, deliberately level. "We'll proceed with the standard evaluation protocol. Miss Morgan, you'll shoot last tonight. The conditions out there are going to be difficult. The wind has been shifting all evening, and the temperature is still dropping. I want you to understand that there will be no modified parameters for this evaluation. What these men do you do?" "I understand," she said. "You won't be given extra time. You won't be given easier targets. If you can't perform at the level we require, this evaluation ends, and you go back to wherever it is you came from." "I understand," she said again, the exact same way she'd said it the first time. Not resigned, not defiant, simply clear. Walker looked at her for a moment that stretched 2 or 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then he stood. "We're on the range in 20 minutes, he said to the room. "Everyone gear up." Outside in the narrow corridor that ran beside the briefing room, Marcus Reed caught up with Joel Watts and kept his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "He knows something," Reed said. "Walker always knows something," Watts said. "No, I mean about the girl specifically." Reed glanced back toward the briefing room door. "Did you see his face when she said her father's name?" Watts had seen it. He didn't confirm that out loud, but the fact that he didn't push back told Reed everything. "Morgan," Reed said quietly, trying the name out like he was looking for a door it might open. "I've heard that name somewhere." "Lots of people named Morgan," Watts said. But he was frowning now, the grin completely gone, and he was doing the same thing Reed was doing, running the name through memory, looking for the corridor it was attached to. They both came up empty. For now. The outdoor range at Ridge Crest was not designed to be forgiving. And on a night like this, in the middle of December in the Nevada desert, it was something considerably less than that. The range ran nearly a mile in its longest configuration. There were multiple shooting positions at different elevations, multiple target systems at varying distances from 300 yards out to just over 1,000. Some targets were fixed, some moved on pre-programmed patterns that could be randomized. The terrain in between was uneven and natural, which meant wine behaved differently at different points on the course depending on what the ground and the sparse vegetation did to the airflow. None of this was explained to Hailey Morgan in any additional detail. The evaluation team received their briefing the same way they always did, factual, precise, without any inflation of difficulty or softening of expectation. And Hailey was expected to understand that briefing and apply it exactly the same as everyone else. She stood at the back of the group during the briefing, her rifle case at her feet, her hands in the pockets of her jacket. She listened. She didn't ask questions. Reed watched her during the briefing, the way he watched candidates during any evaluation phase, reading body language, watching for the signals people gave off when they were overwhelmed or overconfident, because both of those things killed performance and sometimes killed people. He watched for hands that couldn't stay still. He watched for eyes that went blank. He watched for the particular quality of stillness that was actually suppressed panic, the stillness that was too deliberate, too performed. He saw none of those things in Hailey Morgan. What he saw instead was something he didn't have a clean category for. She was listening the way people listened when they intended to use what they heard, not making notes, not reviewing a checklist in her head, actually listening, processing, integrating. Like this wasn't the first time she'd absorbed a briefing about a difficult range in difficult conditions. He almost said something to Watts again. Then he decided to wait. Watch first, then decide what you were looking at. The veterans went in order of seniority. Senior Chief Reed went first. His performance was by any objective standard exceptional. He was a man who had spent 17 years developing and refining a skill that most people didn't even know could be developed to the level he had developed it. On a static range in controlled conditions, his results would have been virtually perfect. Out here in the cold and the wind and the shifting uncertainty of a live desert night, his results were still the kind of results that reminded you why people trained as hard and as long as they did. He came off the range without ceremony, set his weapon down and checked his data without looking particularly pleased with himself, because he wasn't done for the night, and he knew it. There was a girl waiting to go last, and until that was settled, nothing about tonight was settled. The others went one by one. Watts performed, Rodriguez performed, Specialist Carver, who was the youngest of the regular team at 27, performed at a level that pushed even what Walker expected from him and earned a brief nod from the Master Chief, which in Walker's economy of expression was the equivalent of a standing ovation. By the time the sixth man came off the range, the mood of the group had settled into something professional and quiet. The performance had been good across the board. The evaluation had done what it was supposed to do. It had confirmed things that were already known, pushed them a bit in conditions that weren't comfortable, and produced results that justified the investment of a Christmas Eve in the Nevada desert. And then it was Hailey Morgan's turn. Nobody made a joke this time. The jokes had been burned up in the briefing room and hadn't come back. What was left in their place wasn't exactly respect. It hadn't been earned yet. But it was a kind of suspended judgment, a wait and see that had replaced the certainty that had been there before. Hailey walked to the first shooting position and set down her case. She opened it. Walker watched her handle the rifle with the attention he gave to everything that mattered. The way a person handled their equipment in the first 30 seconds told you more than most people understood. You could see the relationship with the instrument. You could see whether it was something they were comfortable with in the deep biological way that spoke of long familiarity, or whether it was something they were trying to appear comfortable with, which was a fundamentally different thing. There was nothing performative in the way she handled the rifle. She checked it the way you checked things you actually cared about, not the way you checked things to demonstrate that you knew the procedure. There was a difference in the hands, in the attention, in the efficiency of the movement. She wasn't going through steps. She was actually verifying. Then she stopped. She didn't set up. She didn't adjust. She didn't move immediately to the firing position. She stopped and she waited. The wind had been shifting all evening in patterns that weren't perfectly predictable. A gust from the northwest settling, then a cross-current from the west itself, then a period of relative stillness that never lasted long enough to fully trust. Reed had worked around it by reading it as best he could and calculating for the deviation. It was the standard approach, the smart approach, the approach of people who had learned to function in imperfect conditions by accepting imperfection as the baseline. Hailey was doing something different. She was standing at the firing position with her eyes slightly closed, and she was feeling the wind, not recording it, not analyzing it, feeling it, like she was trying to understand it in some way that was different from the analytical approach every man on this range used, because the analytical approach was what you learned from training manuals and experience reports in the accumulated formal knowledge of an established discipline, and what Hailey was reaching for was something older than that, something her father had taught her. Watts shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Reed didn't move. Walker watched. And then Hailey Morgan got into position, and everything changed. The first shot landed exactly where it needed to land. Not approximately, not close, exactly. At 450 yards in a crosswind that had been averaging 11 miles an hour with variable gusts on a target that none of the other evaluators had centered perfectly under these exact conditions. She centered it. The range monitor confirmed it immediately. Walker looked at the data, then he looked at the range, then he looked back at the data. He said nothing. The second shot was at 600 yards. It landed exactly where it needed to land. By the time she reached the fifth shot, the men who had been watching with the distant professional attention of people conducting an evaluation, had stopped conducting an evaluation. They were simply watching, the way you watch something that you did not have a prepared framework for, because nothing in your prepared frameworks had predicted it. Reed crossed his arms again, but this time it was not the closed posture of dismissal. It was the posture of a man holding himself very still, because he didn't trust himself to move naturally. Joel Watts had his mouth slightly open. He didn't notice. Hailey worked through the course systematically without visible emotion, without any adjustment in pacing that suggested difficulty, without the small pauses and recalibrations that even excellent shooters made under pressure in difficult conditions. Shot after shot, position after position, distance after distance. When she reached the final position, the one at the far end of the range where the wind behavior was most complex because of the way the terrain channeled it in overlapping directions, she did the same thing she'd done at the start. She stopped. She felt it. She took her time in a way that was not uncertainty and was not hesitation, but was something else entirely, something that looked like conversation. Like she was asking the environment a question and waiting for it to answer before she committed to her response. Then she fired. The target at 980 yards confirmed impact. Center. She stood up from the firing position and began breaking down her rifle with the same unhurried efficiency she'd used to set it up. She wasn't checking her performance. She wasn't looking to the men behind her for reaction. She was just doing what came next, which was securing her equipment. Behind her, nobody spoke for 5 full seconds. That was a long time for men trained to think and respond quickly. 5 seconds of silence from 8 professionals who had spent their careers in environments where silence was tactically significant. Reed finally said something. He said it quietly, mostly to himself, but in a room of people trained to hear quiet things it carried. Well, he said, that was all, but the word carried everything that the silence hadn't been able to hold anymore. Walker was still looking at the performance data when Hailey walked back to the group and set her case down beside her duffel bag. She looked at him with the same direct, quiet attention she'd been giving him since she walked into the briefing room. Is there a second phase tonight? She asked. Walker looked up from the data. He studied her for a moment. This girl, this 17-year-old girl who had walked out of nowhere on Christmas Eve with a worn bag and a rifle case that had clearly been used hard and long, who had stood in a room full of decorated veterans while they laughed at her and had responded with nothing more than 5 quiet words, who had just performed on this range in these conditions in a way that was going to require Walker to reframe several things he had believed to be true about the upper limits of natural marksmanship. Ability was looking at him and asking whether there was more work to do tonight. Not whether she had done well, not whether she had surprised him, not whether the men who had laughed at her were ready to apologize now. She wanted to know if there was more work. Walker closed the data folder. Not tonight, he said. She nodded. She picked up her duffel bag. Where am I billeted? She asked. Walker turned to Chen. Building C room 12, keys at the desk. Hailey picked up her rifle case. She walked toward the building without looking back. The 8 men who had spent the last several hours watching her, several of whom had spent the briefing before that, laughing at her, stood in the Nevada desert on Christmas Eve and watched her go. Reed turned to Walker. That file, he said, the one with all the redactions. Walker looked at him. I want to know what's behind them, Reed said. Walker looked away. Back across the range, back to the last position where a target at 980 yards was still holding the impact point of a shot that shouldn't have been possible in these conditions. Not from someone without institutional training. Not from someone 17 years old. So do I, Walker said, and his voice when he said it carried something that Reed had not heard in it before. Not uncertainty. Walker was not an uncertain man, but something adjacent to it. Something that happened when a person who knew a great deal about a situation suddenly realized they knew much less than they thought. Something that was very close to fear. That night in his office, Walker opened the file again. He read every word that was there, which wasn't much. He sat for a long time looking at the name at the bottom of the authorization. Captain Michael Morgan. He said the name out loud quietly to the empty room. His office had a window that looked out over the desert. The stars were still out. The wind had settled somewhat, though it would pick up again before morning. Somewhere in Building C in room 12, a 17-year-old girl who shot like nobody Walker had ever evaluated in 11 years of doing this was presumably trying to sleep on a military cot on Christmas Eve, far from wherever home was carrying something she hadn't explained and he hadn't yet found a way to ask about. Walker had known a Michael Morgan, not as an acquaintance, not as a professional contact, as something that didn't have a clean category because the things that happened between people in operational environments created relationships that civilian vocabulary wasn't built for. Michael Morgan had been the kind of person you remembered not because he demanded to be remembered, but because you couldn't forget him, because of the way he worked, because of the way he thought, because of what happened when he was in a situation that required everything a person had, and he gave everything without appearing to have been spent by it. And then Michael Morgan had disappeared, on a classified mission in a place Walker was not going to name even in his own thoughts. And the mission had been classified, and the disappearance had been classified, and the investigation that followed, if investigation was even the right word, for what happened after had been classified so thoroughly that Walker had never been able to find out what, if anything, had been concluded. He had tried. He had been told quietly, but without ambiguity, to stop trying. He had stopped. For years now, Michael Morgan had lived in Walker's memory as a closed door. Something that had happened. Something that could not be undone or resolved. Something you carried without being able to put it down. And now his daughter was in Building C Room 12, with a rifle case that had been used hard and long, and a file with more redactions than information, and a priority authorization from someone whose name Walker hadn't seen attached to anything since the door on Michael Morgan's case had been locked shut. Walker sat in his office for a very long time. Outside the window, the Nevada desert held its silence the way it always did. Complete, indifferent, without any particular interest in the things that happened on its surface. But Walker wasn't looking at the desert, he was looking at the file, and asking himself the question he should have started asking 2 days ago when the file first arrived. Not why someone had sent Hailey Morgan here, but why someone had sent her here now, and what was supposed to happen next. The desert does not care about Christmas morning. It was just past 5:30 when the lights in Building C clicked on, triggered by the facility's automated schedule, which ran on military time and had no concept of holidays. Hailey had been awake for 20 minutes already, not because the lights came on and not because the cold had found its way through the wall beside her cot. She was awake because she had learned a long time ago that the moments before a day began were the moments that decided how the day would go. Her father had taught her that. He'd called it the quiet inventory. You didn't reach for your phone. You didn't start moving immediately. You lay still and you took stock of where you were, what you knew, what you didn't know, and what the day was actually going to ask of you. Where she was a military billet in the Nevada desert Christmas morning alone. What she knew she had performed the previous night, and her performance had landed. She had seen it in the faces of the men on the range, in the way the laughter that had greeted her arrival had been replaced by something else entirely. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that didn't have a simple name. What she didn't know everything else. What the day was going to ask of her more than last night. Definitely more than last night. She sat up, put her feet on the cold floor and started getting ready. She was in the common area outside her room by 5:55, and she was not the first one there. Senior Chief Marcus Reed was already at the coffee station, filling a cup with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that the quality of the day's first cup was worth giving proper attention to. He heard her come in and looked over his shoulder, and something crossed his face that was gone before it fully formed. He recovered quickly, poured a second cup without being asked, set it on the counter beside him. "You drink coffee," he said. "Yes," she said. He pushed the cup toward her without ceremony. She picked it up. They stood on opposite sides of the coffee station and drank in silence for a moment that lasted longer than it should have and wasn't uncomfortable in the way that silences between strangers usually were. Reed spoke first. "That last shot," he said, 980, variable wind, no correction time. He wasn't asking a question. He was saying it out loud because the night before he hadn't been able to say anything, and the thing needed to be said somewhere. "The wind came back to its base pattern," she said. "It does that every 4 or 5 minutes if you wait for it. The gusts are random, but the base pattern has a rhythm. My father called it the wind's heartbeat." Reed looked at her. "The wind's heartbeat," he repeated. "It sounds less scientific than the computational method," she said, "but it's faster." Reed set down his cup. He looked at the wall above the coffee station for a moment, thinking something through. Then he looked back at her. "How old were you when he started teaching you?" he said. 7, she said. "The first year it was just fundamentals. Breath control, trigger discipline, stillness. We didn't do any distance work until I was 9. He said if you built the fundamentals wrong, distance just made them worse faster." "Smart man," Reed said, and his voice had a quality in it that wasn't quite wistful, but was something related to it. The tone of someone who had learned the same thing, but had learned it the hard way through the failure that comes from skipping steps. "Yes," she said, "he was." The past tense settled over the room the way past tense always did when it applied to a person who was supposed to still be present tense. Reed heard it. He didn't push on it. "Walker's going to run a second phase today," he said, changing direction. "He didn't say so last night, but I've worked with him long enough to know. What you did out there last night didn't close anything. It opened things." "I know," she said. "You don't seem worried about it." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Worry uses the same mental space as preparation. My father said you could run both at the same time, but you do both worse. So I choose." Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that was for Marcus Reed extremely unusual. He smiled. Not a polite social smile and not the grin of amusement he'd had in the briefing room the night before. Something genuine and brief and a little surprised, like his face had made the decision before his mind approved it. "Eat something before the briefing," he said, moving toward the door. "Walker doesn't schedule breaks." He left. Hailey finished her coffee. She did not look like someone steeling herself for what was coming. She looked like someone who had already decided a long time ago that whatever was coming was going to come regardless, and the only variable she controlled was how ready she'd be when it arrived. She put the cup in the rack and went to find breakfast. The briefing began at 0700. Walker came in without preamble, the way he always came in, and the room quieted the same way it always quieted, not from the authority of rank alone, but from something older than rank. The quality of attention Walker commanded was the kind that had been built over decades of being the person in the room who saw the most and said the least until what he said mattered. He looked at Hailey once briefly and then addressed the room. "Second phase runs in 40 minutes, he said. "Different parameters from last night. Last night was precision under known conditions with controlled variables. This morning introduces unknown distance targets, reduced preparation time, and a course configuration that hasn't been run here before." He let that land. "I'm telling you the course hasn't been run here before, not because I expect you to be nervous about it, but because I expect you to adjust to it. That's the point. The ability to adjust to a configuration you haven't rehearsed is the difference between a range shooter and an operator." Nobody in the room looked at Hailey. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who that last part was directed at. Walker continued. "There will be 9 stations. Unknown distances between 300 and 1,200 yards. Moving targets at 4 of the 9 stations. Crosswind at all of them. You'll have 90 seconds at each station from the moment you take position. No additional time, no do-overs. He looked at his notes. Shooter order is reversed from last night. Miss Morgan shoots first. The room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not of the jokes and laughter of the briefing room the previous night, just a change in the texture of the air. A subtle reorientation because everyone in the room understood that shooting first meant shooting before the group had established a performance baseline for the day's conditions before anyone had gone through the course and come back with information about how the wind was actually behaving out there this morning, before the collective intelligence of the team had been applied to the problem. Shooting first was harder, and Walker had just assigned it without explanation. Hailey said nothing. Watts, sitting 2 seats down from her, looked at her sideways. She was looking at Walker's notes on the display board, the rough course diagram, memorizing the layout, the way you memorize something you were actually going to use. He turned back to the front. Walker finished the briefing in 9 minutes. When he dismissed the room, he caught Hailey's eye and held it for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. And in that fraction, she understood something that he hadn't said aloud. He wasn't trying to break her. He wasn't running the course this way to punish her for the performance last night or to remind her that she didn't belong here. He was running it this way because he needed to see something specific. She just didn't know yet what that something was. She would, though. She was going to figure it out. The morning air hit hard when they stepped outside. Whatever mercy the desert had offered the night before in the way of wind had withdrawn completely. The gusts were frequent and irregular, coming from at least 2 different directions, depending on which part of the range you were standing on, which meant that a reading taken at one station would only partially apply to the station 200 yards away. This was the kind of condition that sorted people very quickly into those who solved problems on the move and those who needed stillness to function. The first station was at the north end of the range. Hailey walked to it, set up, and the clock started. 90 seconds. Unknown distance. The target was a standard silhouette profile, but the markers were masked. No visual reference for the yardage. You had to calculate from the angular size, from the environmental cues, from the convergence of evidence into an estimate that was either close enough or wasn't. Her father had called this one reading the space, not the target, the space between you and the target. The space was full of information if you knew how to read it. The quality of the air at that distance, the way light behaved, the sound of the wind at different points, the invisible architecture of distance. 40 seconds in, she fired. She moved to Station 2. Behind her, Walker watched through binoculars. He saw the impact. He didn't announce it. He wrote something on his board. Station 2 was a moving target. The motion pattern was irregular rather than back and forth. She watched it for 11 seconds, establish the frequency of its irregularity, which was itself a kind of pattern, and she fired in the space between movements. The impact confirmed at Station 2. Station 3 was at the far end of the range, the longest possible shot in this configuration. She estimated the distance at approximately 1,140 yards. The actual distance which Walker had set the night before was 1,162. At that distance, a 22-yard error in distance estimation created a ballistic deviation that was recoverable with adjustment for the environmental variables, and she recovered it. By the 4th station, the men behind her had stopped talking. There had been low, murmured conversation between shots during the early stations, the natural commentary of professionals watching a colleague work. By Station 4, that had stopped. Reed had his binoculars up and hadn't lowered them. Watts was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes fixed on the range in the particular way that meant he was no longer a spectator, but was working through the problem himself, running the same shots in his own mind, measuring what he would have done against what he was watching her do. At Station 7, she encountered the problem. Station 7 was the one Walker had designed differently from anything that had been run on this range before. It wasn't the distance was manageable at around 700 yards. It wasn't the moving target, though the target at Station 7 was faster than anything that had appeared earlier in the course. The problem was that Station 7 had 2 targets, not 2 sequential targets. 2 simultaneous targets moving in converging paths that would briefly overlap before separating again. The standard approach was to take the higher probability shot first and transition for the second. Prioritize. Accept that you are going to miss one to ensure you hit the other. Hailey looked at the setup for 7 seconds. Then she adjusted. She didn't take the higher probability shot first. She tracked the convergence pattern. She calculated the point at which the two targets' paths would place them at a relative position where a single adjusted shot could catch both paths in sequence within the 90-second window. She was looking for a moment that would last less than a second, a brief overlap, not of the targets themselves, but of the optimal firing solution for each. She found it. She fired twice with a transition interval of approximately zero point 0.8 seconds between shots. Both targets confirmed. Reed lowered his binoculars. He turned to look at Walker. Walker was already writing on his board, and he did not look up, but his writing had slowed, in the way that writing slows when the hand is moving carefully because the thing being written matters. "That's not a standard solution," Reed said very quietly. "No," Walker said, still not looking up. "It is not. She created the solution on the spot." "I know what she did." Reed turned back to the range. What he wanted to say was something on the order of "that was the most impressive live problem solving I have witnessed on a range in 17 years of doing this." What he actually said was nothing, because some things needed to stay where they were for a moment before they got put into words and moved around. Hailey finished stations 8 and 9. She came back to the group, set her rifle case down, and looked at Walker with the same clean, unadorned directness she'd given him in every interaction since she arrived. "How did the Station 7 design come to you?" Walker asked. He was looking at his board, but the question was fully intended for her. "It didn't come to me," she said. "I looked at the setup and I read what it was actually asking. Most setups ask you to choose. That one was offering something if you were patient enough to wait for it." "Where did you learn to see that?" She was quiet for a moment. "My father didn't teach me solutions," she said. "He taught me to look longer before I decided what the problem was." The silence that settled over the group after that was the kind of silence that follows a statement that lands in a particular way. Not because it was dramatic or delivered dramatically, but because every person standing there had been trained by someone or had trained others, and every one of them recognized in that sentence exactly the thing that separated technical competence from genuine mastery. Watts exhaled slowly. Reed was doing that thing again, where his arms were crossed and his face was doing something he wasn't entirely in control of. Walker finally looked up from his board. He looked at Hailey Morgan, standing there in the morning desert air, 17 years old, with the rifle case at her feet, in a worn duffel bag back in Building C, and a file in Walker's office that told him almost nothing about who she actually was. "Come to my office at 1300, he said. "There are things I need to understand." It was not a request, but the way she answered it was not the answer of someone responding to an order. "I'll be there," she said, like she'd been waiting for it, like she'd come all the way out here to the Nevada desert on Christmas Eve precisely for the conversation that was finally about to happen. Walker noticed that. He let it go for now, but he noticed it. The second phase wrapped before noon. The team ran the course in their regular order after Hailey completed it, and the performance was solid across the board, because these were professionals, and professionals performed regardless of what had just preceded them. But something had shifted in the group's internal atmosphere in a way that was hard to locate precisely and impossible to ignore. It wasn't deference. These were not men who became deferential toward anyone easily, and certainly not toward a 17-year-old who had arrived 24 hours ago in a truck that looked like it shouldn't still be running. It was something quieter than deference. It was the particular quality of attention that experienced people gave to someone when they had revised their original assessment completely and were still in the process of building the new one. They were watching her differently, not the watching of people waiting for a mistake to justify a prior conclusion. The watching of people who were genuinely uncertain what they were looking at and genuinely interested in finding out. Reed approached her after the debrief while most of the team was moving toward the mess hall for lunch. He fell into step beside her without announcing himself, which was a particular form of communication in itself. The choice to simply be present alongside someone rather than confronting them or initiating with a specific agenda. They walked in silence for a moment. "Station 7, Reed said. "I know," she said. "That's not something you get from reading it in a manual." "No. Was it ever a scenario your father set up for you?" She was quiet long enough that Reed thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, not exactly, but he set up variations of it. He believed most problems in the field had a hidden third option, that most people only look for option one and option two, because that's what they'd been trained to look for and training was valuable, but it was also a cage if you let it become the boundary of what you thought was possible. Reed walked beside her in silence for several steps. Your father sounds like someone I would have wanted to know, he said. It was a careful sentence constructed deliberately, leaving room for her to decide how much to offer in return. She looked at him sideways. A lot of people who met him thought that, she said. Very few people actually did. There was something in the way she said it. Not grief exactly, though grief was somewhere in the vicinity. Something harder than grief and more contained. The kind of feeling that had been lived with long enough that it had lost its raw edges and developed a different kind of weight. Not lighter, just more evenly distributed. Reed didn't pursue it further, but the sentence stayed with him all the way to lunch and well past it. At 12:55, Hailey knocked on the frame of Walker's open office door. He looked up. He'd been sitting at his desk for the better part of an hour, and the file that had been thin to begin with was open in front of him, but he hadn't been reading it. He'd been thinking alongside it. There was a difference. Come in, he said. Close the door. She came in and closed the door and sat down in the chair across from his desk. She didn't look around the office. She didn't let her eyes travel to the photographs on the wall or the commendations behind him. She looked at him and she waited. Walker picked up the file. I'm going to tell you something I don't normally tell candidates, he said. I'm telling you because whatever is happening here is clearly beyond the scope of a standard evaluation, and I don't believe in managing people through information they need by giving them less than they need. He set the file down. I have spent the last 14 hours trying to understand why you're here, and I have arrived at the conclusion that the answer to that question requires something from you that this file doesn't contain. She nodded. So I'm asking directly, he said. Why are you here, Miss Morgan? She was quiet for a moment. Not the practiced quiet of someone deciding how much to reveal. The deeper quiet of someone who had arrived at the beginning of something they'd been building toward for a long time and were now standing at the threshold of it and making sure they were ready to step through. My father disappeared 3 years ago, she said. On a classified mission, I was told he was gone. I was given a flag and a form letter and a number to call if I had questions, and when I called the number, I was told the case was closed. Walker's expression didn't change. But the case wasn't closed, she continued, because 6 months ago I received something in the mail, no return address, no letter inside, just a photograph. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed a photograph on the desk between them. Walker looked at it. It was an aerial image. A facility of some kind in a location that Walker's experienced eye immediately identified as not American and not friendly. In the lower left corner of the image, barely visible, was a figure. The image was low resolution, grainy with the quality of something taken from considerable distance or altitude. But there was something about the figure's posture, the particular way it stood, that made Walker's chest tighten. He looked up at her. Where did this come from? His voice was level, but something underneath it had changed. I don't know, she said, but I know what it means, and I think you know what it means too. Walker picked up the photograph. He held it close. His eyes moved across it with the focused attention of someone who had spent a career reading images like this, extracting information from what was visible and from what was conspicuously absent. This figure, he said. Yes, she said. You believe this is your father. It was not a question. He could hear it in everything she'd been carrying since she walked, in the shape of what she wasn't saying, the structure of what she had said. I know it's my father, she said. I know how he stands. I know the way he holds his shoulders. I've known him my whole life. That's him. Walker set the photograph down. And what happened inside him in that moment was something he had not expected and was not prepared for. Because Marcus Reed had been right in the hallway the night before when he'd said that Walker knew something, that something specific had moved behind Walker's eyes when Hailey said her father's name. And Reed had been right, because Walker did know something. He had known something for 3 years that he had been carrying in the same way you carry something too heavy to put down and too dangerous to set down carelessly in public. He had known that Michael Morgan's mission had gone wrong in a way that the official account did not reflect. He had known because He had been close enough to the operational edge of it to see things that the formal record hadn't preserved or had preserved in a form that was carefully shaped to say something other than what had actually happened. He had known and he had been told to stop looking, and he had stopped. And now Michael Morgan's daughter was sitting across from him with a photograph that suggested the official account of what had happened to Captain Michael Morgan was not just incomplete, it was wrong. Walker was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Hailey let him be quiet. She had the patience of someone who had waited 3 years for this room. "Who sent you here?" Walker said. "Someone who knew you and my father," she said. "Someone who said you were the one person who might look at this photograph and not tell me to move on." "Who?" Walker said. His voice was sharp now in a way it hadn't been. Not angry, urgently precise. She reached into her jacket again and placed a single card on the desk. Walker looked at the name on it. His face did what faces did when they encountered something they weren't ready for. A brief failure of the professional surface, a crack in the controlled expression that he'd maintained through 11 years of evaluating people in difficult conditions. The name on the card was a name from that mission, from that classified corridor that had been locked shut, a name that belonged to someone Walker had believed for 3 years was unreachable, someone who had just reached out, through a 17-year-old girl with a rifle case and a photograph. "He's alive," Walker said, and the words came out smaller than he'd intended, the voice of a man who had been carrying a grief that had just been reclassified. "I was alive when this photograph was taken," she said carefully. "I don't know about now. That's why I'm here." She looked at him directly, fully, with everything she was bringing to this room and had been bringing to it since the moment she knocked on the frame of his door. "I need to find out if he's still alive, and I need the kind of help that doesn't come from a civilian. I need the kind of help that comes from someone who knew him, who knows what he was doing, and who can look at that photograph and tell me what they see." Walker looked at the photograph. For a long time, the desert outside his window was doing what it always did, being exactly itself, offering nothing and requiring nothing. Indifferent to the weight of what was happening inside the small office where a man who had carried a closed door for 3 years was being asked to open it again. He picked up the photograph. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "I know," she said. "And I need you to stay on base. Don't leave. Don't discuss this with the evaluation team." "I haven't discussed it with anyone." He looked at her. "You've been carrying this alone," he said. It wasn't admiring. It was something more complicated than admiration. The recognition of a cost. "My father didn't raise me to wait for someone else to start," she said. Walker stood up, unheld the photograph in one hand and the card in the other, and he stood behind his desk in his office on Christmas Day in the Nevada desert. And he was 51 years old, and he had spent those years building walls around the things that couldn't be fixed. And one of those walls had just developed a crack that was going to let in everything he'd been keeping out. He looked at the girl across the desk. 17 years old. She had driven out here alone in a truck, held together by stubbornness and maintenance debt, to a facility she'd never been to on a holiday, carrying nothing but the tools she needed and the certainty that she was right. She had walked into a room of men who laughed at her and responded with 5 quiet words. She had performed on a range in conditions that should have been impossible for someone without institutional training, and she had performed at a level that had shifted something in Walker's understanding of what was actually possible. She had done all of that alone, because her father had taught her that the hardest targets were the ones where you didn't have the option of waiting for backup. Walker moved toward the door, then he stopped. His hand was on the door frame, his back still toward her. "Your father," he said without turning around. "He used to say something. I'm trying to remember the exact words." Hailey was quiet. "Something about patience," Walker said. "About the difference between waiting and preparing. I'm trying to remember how he said it." Hailey's voice, when it came, was very quiet, like she was reading from something kept in a place that didn't get open for just anyone. He said, "Patience isn't waiting. Patience is working in silence while you wait." Walker stood in the door frame. He didn't say anything. After a moment, he walked out. But his hand, before it left the frame of the door, pressed briefly and firmly against the wood. A small, private thing, the kind of gesture that happened when the body knew what the words couldn't yet say. Hailey sat alone in the office. Outside the window, the desert light was shifting into its midday clarity. Everything flattened and exposed, nowhere to hide in a landscape that offered no shadows at this hour. She looked at it without seeing it because she wasn't out there. She was in the place she had been living for 3 years, the interior terrain of someone who had a mission with no guarantee of success, who had taken every step anyway, who had arrived exactly here, exactly now, and was waiting, in exactly the way her father had taught her, working in silence while she waited. But in the distance, somewhere in the administrative wing of Ridgecrest Advanced Training Facility, on a Christmas afternoon, Master Chief Daniel Walker was making a phone call. And somewhere at the other end of that call, something that had been locked for 3 years was about to be asked to open. And in the facility security system at that precise moment, a notification appeared that nobody in the building was watching yet. An access credential had just been used at the outer perimeter gate. A credential belonging to a man named Captain Michael Morgan. A man who, according to every official record in the Department of Defense, had been dead for 3 years. The security alert sat unnoticed for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That was how long it took for Petty Officer Second Class Linda Chen to return from lunch, settle back into her chair at the security monitoring station, reach for her coffee, and glance at the screen with the particular half-attention that people gave to displays they expected to show them nothing. Her eyes moved across the notification the way eyes moved across things they were prepared to dismiss. And then her brain caught up with what her eyes had just passed over, and she set the coffee cup down very carefully, the way people set things down when their hands had suddenly stopped trusting themselves. She read it again. Credential access, outer perimeter, timestamp 130422, authorization ID MO7731 capped. Name attached to the credential Morgan Michael A. Captain. Clearance level classified. Status in the system inactive. Reason for inactive status. KIA 3 years prior. Chen stared at the screen for approximately 3 seconds. Then she picked up her radio. Walker was mid-sentence on the phone call he'd placed from his office when Chen's voice came through the radio on his desk. He heard the words and he stopped talking mid-sentence, which was something the person on the other end of that call had never heard Daniel Walker do in 20 years of knowing him. "Say that again," Walker said into the radio. Chen said it again. Walker put the phone down without ending the call. He picked up the radio. "Lock down the outer perimeter. Nobody in or out without my direct authorization. Get Reed and Watts to my office in 2 minutes. Do not put this on the general channel." "Copy," Chen said, and her voice was impressively steady for someone who had just told her commanding officer that a dead man had used his credentials to attempt facility access. Walker stood for a moment in the center of his office. He looked at the photograph still sitting on his desk. He looked at the card beside it. He looked at the door behind which somewhere in Building C, Hailey Morgan was either in her room or somewhere on the base alone, having just told him everything she knew and waited for him to make a phone call he hadn't finished making. He picked up the phone. "I need to call you back," he said into it. "Walker." 10 minutes, he said and put it down. I was moving towards the door before the phone finished settling into its cradle. Reed and Watts arrived at Walker's office in under 90 seconds, which told Walker they had both been close by and moving fast, which told him that the security alert had already moved through the informal communication network of the evaluation team in the time between Chen's radio call and their arrival, because that was how tight units worked. Information traveling faster than official channels, because the people in the unit were always more connected to each other than any communication system management design. "Sit down," Walker said. Neither of them sat. They stood the way men stood when the situation told them sitting was the wrong configuration. Walker decided not to push it. "You both know what the alert said," he said. "Morgan," Reed said. "Not a question." "Yes." "There are a lot of Morgans," Watts said, and he was not being dismissive, he was being precise. "Could be coincidence. Credential recycling database error, someone running a test. The authorization ID is specific to Captain Michael Morgan," Walker said. "It is not a recycled credential. It has not been reassigned. It has been inactive in the system for 3 years, and it just activated at our outer perimeter gate 14 minutes ago." The room was quiet. "Where is the girl?" Reed said. It was exactly the right question, and the fact that Reed had arrived at it before Walker had to direct him there confirmed Walker's read of him as someone who understood the architecture of a situation quickly. "Building C," Walker said. "As far as I know." "We should confirm that," Reed said. "Immediately." Not a suggestion, a statement of what needed to happen in the next 30 seconds. Walker picked up his radio. Chen, visual confirmation on Miss Morgan, Building C common area or room 12, now. 20 seconds, then Chen's voice. Room 12, Master Chief, doors closed, lights on. Walker exhaled something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. All right, he said. He turned to face Reed and Watts fully. I need to tell you both something that does not leave this room until I decide otherwise. What I'm about to say changes the operational context of this evaluation significantly, and I need you both to process it as quickly as you can and come back to me with clear heads. Watts looked at Reed. Reed looked at Walker. Hailey Morgan came here carrying more than her gear, Walker said. She came with a photograph and information suggesting that Captain Michael Morgan may not have died 3 years ago, that his disappearance was something other than what the official record describes. He picked up the photograph from his desk and handed it to Reed. Someone sent this to her anonymously. The figure in the lower left quadrant. She believes it's her father. I believe she may be right. Reed held the photograph. He looked at it the way Walker had looked at it, with professional attention extracting what was there. Watts leaned over his shoulder. 30 seconds of silence. This facility, Watts said. He tapped the image. This isn't ours. No, Walker said. Where is it? I don't know yet, but the photograph came with a card. Walker held up the card. Watts read the name on it from across the desk. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign of a reaction that was running considerably deeper than that. That name, Watts said carefully, is someone I was told to stop asking about 18 months ago. Same order I received, Walker said. Different timeline. Reed set the photograph down. You think the credential access tonight is connected to the photograph? I think everything that has happened in the last 24 hours is connected, Walker said. I think Hailey Morgan was sent here deliberately to this facility to reach me specifically. I think whoever sent her knew that she would perform in a way that would earn access to this office. And I think the credential access tonight is not a coincidence. It is a signal. Watts frowned. A signal to who? To me, Walker said, or to her, or to both of us. Another silence. Outside the window, the desert afternoon was pressing down on everything with the particular weight of a sky that had burned off all its cloud cover and had nowhere left to go. Reed spoke. If Morgan is alive, he said slowly, building the sentence carefully the way you built anything you wanted to hold weight, then 3 years of official record is fabricated. And fabrication at that classification level doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone with significant authority decided that the true account was less useful than a false one. Yes, Walker said. Which means, Watts said, picking up the thread, that whoever buried the true account is still in a position to protect it, still active, still watching. Which means, Reed said, completing the structure, that this base right now may not be as secure as we think it is. Because if someone used Morgan's credential to access the perimeter tonight, they either had access to the credential itself, which means they've been inside our system, or they are Morgan, which means something else entirely. The weight of that last sentence settled over all three of them. Walker looked at his watch. 30:31. I need to talk to the girl, he said. Reed moved toward the door. I'll come with you. No, Walker said. Stay here under the security board. If anything else activates on that system, I want to know before Chen finishes processing it. He looked at Watts. Get to the outer perimeter. Talk to whoever was on gate duty when that credential came through. I want a description of anything that passed that gate in the last 2 hours. Vehicle, foot, anything. Watts was already moving. Walker went to Building C. He knocked on the door of room 12. One knock, solid, not aggressive. Hailey opened the door in under 3 seconds. She had not been sleeping. She was still in her range gear and her eyes were clear and focused in the way they always were, and for a half second, Walker registered again the particular quality of her readiness that he had not stopped noticing since she arrived. She read his face. Something happened, she said. Inside, he said. She stepped back. He came in. The room was small and spare, and she had made almost no impression on it. The duffel bag was on the floor by the wall, unopened since last night, rifle case beside it. The bed was made. She had not settled in. She had arrived and stayed ready. Walker stood in the center of the room. He did not sit. Your father's access credential was just used at our outer perimeter gate, he said. He watched her face. What happened there was the most complex thing he had seen in 24 hours of watching an unusually complex person. Not surprise, not the shock of information that contradicts what you believed. Something that looked closer to confirmation. Like a piece of information she had been carrying for a long time as a question had just been handed back to her as an answer. He's here, she said, not loud, almost to herself. We don't know that, Walker said carefully. What we know is that his credential was used. That could mean, he's here, she said again. And this time it was not almost to herself. It was directly to Walker, and it was firm without being aggressive. You don't know him the way I do. This is how he moves. He doesn't make contact directly. He signals first. He creates a marker, something only specific people will understand, and he waits to see who responds to it and how. Walker looked at her. He's been watching this base, she continued, since I arrived. Maybe before. He wanted to see if I would get here. And he wanted to see who you were and what you did when I got here. The credential is him telling you he's close enough to be reached. Or it's someone who has access to his credential using it as bait, Walker said, because he had to save it. Because in the world he operated in, the charitable interpretation was frequently the wrong one, and people got hurt when they chose it without verifying. Hailey was quiet for a moment. You're right that it could be that, she said, but I don't think it is. She crossed her arms, not in the closed posture of someone shutting down, but in the posture of someone holding their own certainty, steady against pressure. He sent me here. He sent the photograph. He sent the card with your name. He's been orchestrating this since before I left home. The credential is the next step. What's the step after the credential? Walker said. She looked at him steadily. You go to the gate, she said. You go to the perimeter and you respond to the signal, and he comes to you. Walker held her gaze for several long seconds. In those seconds, he ran everything he knew about Michael Morgan through his memory, the operational approach, the tactical philosophy, the way the man had moved through difficult environments, and he recognized in Hailey's description something that fit. It fit accurately, with the precision of someone who had learned it from the source. He picked up his radio. Reed, he said. Go ho, Reed said. I'm going to the outer perimeter. We're covered. If Chen flags anything else in the system, I want it on my radio in real time. And Reed, keep this off the general channel. Just us. A brief pause. Copy that, Reed said. And then lower Walker. Be careful. Walker clipped the radio back to his belt. He looked at Hailey. You stay here, he said. She shook her head, immediately and without apology. No, Miss Morgan. He's my father, she said. Quiet, absolute. The kind of quiet that didn't move. I have been trying to find him for 3 years. I am not staying in this room. Walker looked at her for a long moment. The argument he could have made was sound. She was a civilian. This was a potentially active security situation. He was responsible for her safety on this base. All of that was true. He knew it, and she knew it, and they both knew the other knew it. He also knew that if Michael Morgan was out there at the perimeter, and if this was the signal, Hailey said it was the one person whose presence would matter most at that perimeter was the one standing in front of him. Stay behind me, he said. You do not move past me unless I clear it. Understood, she said. She picked up her jacket. They walked. The outer perimeter of Ridgecrest was 3/4 of a mile from Building C, and Walker set a pace that covered that distance in under 8 minutes. Hailey kept up without apparent effort, which no longer surprised him, but which he continued to register. Watts was waiting at the checkpoint when they arrived. He was standing with Briggs, the specialist from the previous night, whose expression carried the particular combination of alertness and uncertainty that people wore when they were present for something that exceeded the parameters of their usual post. Report, Walker said. Watts turned. He saw Hailey. Something crossed his face. He looked at Walker. Walker nodded once. It's all right. Watts accepted that. Nothing passed through the gate in either direction in the time window we're looking at. Gate log shows the credential was presented electronically, not physical card. Digital transmission from somewhere within 200 meters of the gate. No vehicle, no visual contact on any of the cameras. Within 200 meters, Walker said. That's the transmission range for the credential system. Walker looked out past the gate into the desert that extended in every direction from the perimeter fence. The afternoon light made the terrain look flat and exposed, but he knew this land well enough to know that it had depressions and rises that didn't read clearly from a fixed point that someone who knew the terrain could be within 200 meters of this gate and effectively invisible to a camera system that had fixed angles and fixed light calibration. He's out there, Hailey said very quietly. You can't know that, Watts said, not unkindly. I know it, she said. She was looking at a specific point out past the fence line. Walker followed her gaze. There was nothing visible, nothing that his eyes could separate from the general terrain. Hailey B. Walker said, keeping his voice low and level. What are you seeing? Nothing, she said. I'm not seeing anything. She paused. There's a depression about 160 meters out at 2 o'clock from the gate post. My father used to describe that kind of position. Low elevation, lateral visibility, clear line to the approach point. He called it a greeting position, a place you went not to hide but to be findable by the right person. Walker looked at the 2 o'clock position. He could not see the depression from where he was standing, but he knew the terrain and he thought she was right that something like that existed in roughly that location. He keyed his radio. Read, I need eyes on the exterior perimeter, 2 o'clock position from the main gate. Infrared if available on the external cameras. Tell me if you pick up anything in the 150 to 200 meter range. 15 seconds, 20. Then Reed's voice, and it was carrying something that it hadn't carried before. Walker, I've got a heat signature, single, stationary, 172 meters, 2 o'clock. Nobody at the gate spoke. Hailey's hand found the fence post beside her and gripped it just briefly, just for a second, and then released it. Walker saw it. He didn't acknowledge it. He understood it. He unclipped his radio. Morgan said into it, knowing the frequency wasn't going to reach wherever the signal had been transmitted, from knowing he was speaking to the desert into the heat signature on a camera, knowing this was not the rational tactical response and not caring. Michael, if you're out there, I'm at the gate. Come in. The desert did not answer. 40 seconds passed. And then Briggs, who had been standing at the gate console with his eyes on the perimeter road, said in a voice that had gone very careful and very quiet, Master Chief, movement, 2 o'clock. Everyone turned. A figure was walking toward the gate. Coming out of the terrain, the way figures came out of terrain that had swallowed them, emerging from a depression that was invisible until someone rose out of it, and then suddenly they were there moving through the desert light with a gait that covered ground efficiently without appearing to hurry. The figure was wearing civilian clothes. Weathered practical, a jacket that had been used hard and for a long time. Dark hair with gray through it that the desert light caught and made visible. A face that was at this distance, still resolving out of the general mass of the approaching person into the specific individual. Hailey had not moved. She was standing at the fence with both hands now on the gatepost, and she was watching the figure come toward her with the expression of someone whose entire body wanted to move and who was holding themselves still through a discipline that came from a very deep place. Walker watched the figure. I was running the face through memory as it resolved. 3 years. People changed in 3 years, especially in circumstances that took things from them. The jaw, the forehead, the way the shoulders sat, the particular quality of the walk that Hailey had described once as covering ground without appearing to hurry. And he could see exactly what she meant because it was right there in front of him. The walk of someone who had spent years moving through environments where efficiency of movement was survival. The figure was 50 meters from the gate. Walker said nothing. 40 meters, 30, at 20 meters, Walker could see the eyes. And he knew. He had known those eyes. He had worked beside those eyes in places that neither of them could name in any company. He had seen those eyes make calculations under pressure that Walker himself couldn't have made in twice the time. He had seen those eyes look at impossible situations and find the non-standard solution, the hidden third option, the one that existed only if you were patient enough to look longer before you decided what the problem was. He knew those eyes. He knew the man behind them. Walker's hand went to the gate latch. He hesitated for exactly 1 second, the second of a man who understood that opening a gate was not always a physical act, that some gates once opened could not be closed again and would change everything that came after them. He opened it. And before Walker could say anything, before Watts could process the situation, before Briggs could do anything except stare, Hailey Morgan let go of the gate post and walked forward, and the man coming through the gate walked forward, and they met in the space between the perimeter and the checkpoint. And it was not a cinematic reunion. It was not clean or composed or photogenic. It was a girl who had been 17 years old when her father vanished and was still 17 years old when she found him again, gripping a person who was real and present and alive, and a man who had not been findable for 3 years, holding his daughter in the desert on Christmas afternoon, and making no sound except the particular breathing of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and has just been given permission to release it. Walker looked away. Watts looked away. Briggs was 23 years old, and he had never in his military career looked away from anything more deliberately. When Walker looked back, father and daughter had separated to the distance where they could see each other's faces. Michael Morgan was looking at Hailey with the expression of a man taking inventory of someone he loves after too long an absence, checking for damage, cataloging what time had done. Then Michael Morgan looked at Walker. And Walker saw something in that look that moved through his chest like a current. Gratitude. Not the social kind. The kind that came from someone who knew exactly what it had cost another person to open a gate that should have stayed shut, according to every official instruction. Daniel, Michael Morgan said. Walker's voice, when it came, was not entirely steady. "You look terrible," he said. Morgan looked down at himself. At the worn jacket, the desert dust on his boots, the 3 years written into his face. He looked back up. "I've been having a difficult few years," he said. And Walker, for the first time in as long as he could remember, laughed. It was brief, and it was real, and it broke something open in the space between them that needed to be broken. "Get inside," Walker said. "All of you." He looked at Watts, who nodded once with the compressed efficiency of a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him and exactly how serious it was. Then Walker looked at Briggs. Briggs looked back at him. "Specialist," Walker said quietly. "You didn't see anything at this gate in the last 15 minutes. Briggs looked at the space where Michael Morgan had been standing. He looked at Walker. "I was 23 years old, 2 tours in, and he had been assigned to checkpoint duty on Christmas Day as character building, and he was in the process of understanding that whatever character was being built in him today was going to be a considerably more complex structure than he'd anticipated when he came on duty this morning." "Understood, Master Chief," he said. Walker put his hand briefly on the specialist's shoulder. Just briefly. The weight of acknowledgement. Then Walker turned and followed Michael Morgan and Hailey toward the facility, and behind him the gate closed and the Nevada desert went back to being exactly itself, indifferent, incomplete, holding no record of what had just happened within its boundary. But inside Building C in Walker's office, with the door closed and the radio switched to a secure frequency, and the photograph still on the desk between them. Michael Morgan looked at the file with his name on it, at the photograph that someone had sent to his daughter, at the card with a name on it that had set all of this in motion, and he began to explain 3 years of a story that the official record had decided didn't exist. And Walker listened, and Hailey listened. And what they heard in that office over the next 40 minutes did not make anything simpler. It made everything considerably more dangerous, because Michael Morgan had not simply survived a classified mission gone wrong. He had survived it with knowledge, specific, documented, verifiable knowledge about what had happened on that mission and why it had gone wrong and who had made the decisions that sent it wrong and what those people had done since to make sure the true account stayed buried. He had survived with names, and now those names were in the room. And somewhere in the operational infrastructure of the people, those names belonged to an alarm had just activated because a dead man's credentials had been used at a military facility. And someone who monitored such things had just received a notification, and they were not going to let it sit unattended the way Linda Chen had let it sit for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. They were going to respond, and they were going to respond fast. The names Michael Morgan spoke in Walker's office that afternoon were not the names of strangers. That was the thing that made it worse. Not foreign operatives. Not unknown actors working in the dark margins of an adversarial intelligence service. These were names from inside, names with American addresses and American paychecks and American flags on their walls, names that appeared on organizational charts in buildings in Washington, D.C. that had security clearances and cafeterias and parking spaces with reserved signs on them. Morgan sat in the chair across from Walker's desk, the same chair his daughter had occupied 3 hours earlier, and he spoke for 38 minutes without stopping. Walker did not interrupt. Hailey sat against the wall to Morgan's left, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, the whole body listening, the kind that recorded not just words but the spaces between them. Morgan was thin in the way that people became thin when food had been a logistical problem rather than a daily given for an extended period. He had 3 years on his face that hadn't been there before. His hands, when he set them on the desk to punctuate a point, were steadier than Walker had any right to expect, and Walker registered that as something significant. The hands told you what the face could sometimes hide. Morgan's hands told him that whatever the 3 years had cost, the man behind them had not been broken by the expense. He told them about the omission, the real version, not the version in the classified report that had been shaped into something manageable and filed away in a drawer that official channels agreed to stop opening. The actual sequence of events in the order they had actually occurred, with the cause and effect that the official record had carefully dissolved. The mission had been compromised before it launched. Not by enemy intelligence, by a decision made domestically by people with authority over the operational parameters, who had made a calculation that had nothing to do with the mission's stated objective and everything to do with a separate agenda that the mission's personnel were not informed of and would not have agreed to if they had been. Morgan had discovered the compromise partway through the operation. Not soon enough to stop what happened, but soon enough to document it. He had gotten the documentation out through a channel that the people who made the compromising decision didn't know he had access to. That was why he was still alive. Not because they hadn't tried to remove him, because removing him without also retrieving the documentation would have left the evidence in circulation, and they couldn't accept that risk. So instead, they had filed him as KIA and waited for him to surface. Han had spent 3 years not surfacing while he built the case into something that couldn't be dismissed or absorbed by the same institutional machinery that had buried the original truth. He had moved carefully. He had used people he trusted completely, a very short list, to gather corroborating material. And he had watched his daughter from a distance that cost him more than anything else the 3 years had taken, because watching her carry his absence without being able to correct it was the specific cruelty in everything he'd been carrying. He had sent her the photograph when the case was ready, not a moment before. When he finished talking, the room was quiet in the way that rooms got quiet when a large structure of information had just been placed into them, and the people present were adjusting to its weight. Walker exhaled slowly. "How many copies of the documentation exist?" he said. "3, Morgan said. Separate locations, separate formats, separate custodians." "Who are the custodians?" Morgan looked at him steadily. "The kind of people who know what to do with it if I stop being reachable." Walker understood that. He didn't push for names. "And the names you gave me, the people responsible for the original compromise. You have documentation connecting them directly." "Directly and specifically," Morgan said. "Not circumstantial, not inferred, recorded, with dates, with the decision trail, with communications that were supposed to be deleted and weren't deleted completely enough." "If this goes to the right people," Watts began. "It has to reach the right people first," Morgan said. "That's the problem. The people it needs to reach are surrounded by people who have an interest in it not reaching them. The institutional pathways are not safe." He leaned forward. "That's why I came here. This facility, this evaluation, this specific team." He looked at Walker. "You were the one person I knew with both the operational credibility and the direct access to deliver this above the compromise level. You've stayed clean. Daniel, I've been watching long enough to know that." Walker looked at him. "You've been watching this facility," he said. "For 6 weeks, Morgan confirmed. Something passed through the room at that admission. Not accusation, understanding. The recognition that the architecture of what Morgan had built around this moment had been much larger than any of them had known. That the arrival of a 17-year-old girl on Christmas Eve had been the visible tip of something that had been constructed with considerable patience over a significant period of time. Watts said what everyone in the room was calculating. "If they know you used your credential," Watts said, and his voice had the measured quality of someone forcing himself to be precise, when urgency was pushing in the other direction. "And there is a monitoring system on inactive credentials belonging to people who were classified KIA, then we have a time problem." Morgan looked at him. "How long do we have?" Walker asked. "From credential activation to response deployment," Morgan said. "Depending on how their monitoring is and how close their nearest assets are, I estimated between 4 and 8 hours. That was my window when I activated the credential. It's been approximately 2 hours since activation." "So 2 to 6 hours remaining," Watts said. "At the outside," Morgan said. Walker was already standing. He moved to his desk and picked up his secure line. "I need to reach Admiral Corrigan's office directly." Not through the chain, direct. He looked at Watts. Get Reed in here, and I need Chen monitoring every access point on this facility. If anything external approaches this base in the next 6 hours, I want 30 seconds warning. Watts was out the door before Walker finished the sentence. Walker dialed. While he waited for the connection, he looked at Morgan. You should have come to me sooner. Morgan looked back at him. I needed the case to be complete, he said. Incomplete evidence doesn't hold against the kind of institutional weight these people have. It gets absorbed, dismissed, and then you're exposed without protection. He paused. And I needed to know you were still the person I remembered. How did you decide I was? Walker said. Morgan glanced at Hailey. She told me, he said. Walker looked at Hailey. She was watching her father with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously, the relief that hadn't fully landed yet, the 3 years of carried weight that hadn't fully lifted yet, and something steadier underneath all of that, something that looked like the specific satisfaction of someone who had done a very difficult thing correctly. The line connected. Walker turned to face the wall. The conversation he had with the other end of that line lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Hailey counted, not obsessively, the way her father had taught her to track time in situations where time was the operative variable. You knew how much you had by knowing how much was passing. When Walker put the phone down, he turned back to the room. Corsibet is dispatching a secure transport team, he said. ETA approximately 4 hours. Morgan, your documentation needs to be in hand before that team arrives. Can you retrieve it from here? One of the 3 copies is retrievable within 90 minutes, Morgan said. The channel is established. I need a secure communication line. Chen can set that up in 10 minutes, Walker said. He moved toward the door and then something in the room changed. The radio on Walker's desk activated. Chen's voice came through and the quality of it was different from any transmission she'd sent in the past 24 hours. Not panicked, Chen did not panic, but compressed in the way voices got compressed when the person transmitting had just received information that they were processing and transmitting simultaneously. Master Chief, we have a vehicle on the access road. Commercial plate, no military designation. Moving at approach speed. ETA to outer perimeter 4 minutes. Walker picked off on radio. How many occupants? Camera resolution at that distance I can make out 2, possibly 3. Watts's voice came over the same channel from somewhere near the perimeter. I've got them on visual from the gate. 2 in front, definitely a 3rd in back. They're not lost, Master Chief. The way they're moving on that road, they know exactly where they're going. Walker looked at Morgan. Morgan's face had changed, not dramatically, but the particular focus that had been in it during the conversation had sharpened into something more operational, something that was reading the new information and recalculating. That's faster than my window, he said. It was not panic. It was the precise statement of a man acknowledging that a variable had come in outside his expected parameters. Either their monitoring is more current than I estimated, or they had assets pre-positioned. Pre-positioned where, Walker said. Close enough to respond in 2 hours, Morgan said. Which means they were watching this facility already, before tonight, before the credential. The implication of that landed in the room the way heavy things land, not loudly, with finality. They had not been triggered by the credential activation alone. They had been watching Ridgecrest. They had known or suspected that this was where Morgan's operation was converging. The credential had not been the alarm that sent them. It had been the confirmation. Walker keyed his radio. Reed, we have incoming. Non-military vehicle, 3 occupants, 4 minutes out. It's out. I need you and the evaluation team at the main building entrance. Armed in position, but do not engage unless I give the order. These people may be carrying federal credentials. We treat this as a federal approach until we know otherwise. Reed's response was immediate. Copy. On our way. Walker turned to the room. Morgan, you need to not be visible from the main entrance. Daniel, I'm not hiding you, Walker said firmly. I'm protecting the documentation. If they're here for what I think they're here for, they don't move on a military facility with 3 people in a commercial vehicle unless they think they can do it quietly, which means they're planning to present credentials and a legal-sounding reason for taking someone into custody. If they take you before Corrigan's team arrives, the documentation doesn't move. It sits in whatever channel you established, and eventually someone finds the custodians and the whole case collapses. Morgan looked at him. He understood the logic. He didn't like it, which was visible, but he was too experienced a person to let dislike of a correct tactical assessment override the assessment itself. Hailey stays with me, he said. Hailey stays with you, Walker agreed. He looked at Hailey. She was already standing. She had not been sitting since Reed's voice came through the radio. She was standing by her father with the rifle case on the floor between them, and her face had the quality it had had on the range when she was at Station 7, looking at a setup nobody else would have approached the way she approached it. She was reading the problem, finding the option that wasn't standard. The documentation, she said to her father. The copy that's retrievable in 90 minutes. Can you retrieve it faster? Morgan looked at her. How much faster? 30 minutes, she said. If the channel is available and the custodian is ready. Possibly. Then start it now, she said. Before those people get to the gate, whatever Walker's team does at the entrance buys time. Use the time. Morgan looked at Walker. Walker picked up his desk phone and called Chen directly. Miss Morgan needs a secure line established in the communications room in the next 4 minutes. Priority override. Make it happen. He hung up and looked at Hailey. Your father's right, he said. You are extraordinarily like him. She looked at Walker. Don't let them take him, she said. It was not a plea. It was not an emotional outburst. It was a person who had found her father after 3 years and was not prepared to have the distance reinstated by people in a commercial vehicle on a desert access road, and who was communicating that with the same directness and lack of ornamentation she brought to everything. Nobody is taking anybody, Walker said. He walked out of the office toward the main entrance. The vehicle arrived at the outer gate at 1409. It was a dark SUV, government adjacent, in the way that commercial vehicles sometimes were when the people inside them wanted to look official without being officially traceable. Briggs was at the gate again, which Walker had not specifically requested, but which told him something about the specialist's instincts. When Walker arrived at the entrance, Briggs was already engaged with the 2 men who had stepped out of the front of the SUV and the third who had stepped out of the rear and was hanging back in a way that experienced people recognized as a covering position. The 2 men at the front had badges out. Federal badges, real ones from the look of them, the kind that were issued by an agency that existed in the official record and had legitimate jurisdiction over a range of matters that a military installation commander was obligated to take seriously. Reed and 2 members of the evaluation team were at positions to the right of the entrance. Not aggressive positions, present positions, the kind that communicated that the people inside this facility were not unprepared for unexpected visitors. Walker stepped forward. Master Chief Walker, he said direct and clear, this is a restricted military training facility. I understand you're presenting federal credentials. I'd like to know the purpose of your visit. The lead man was in his mid-40s, a face that had been organized into a professional neutral that had been practiced for a long time. He held his badge at a distance. Walker could read, Special Agent Carl Donovan. The name was the same as the sergeant from the briefing room the night before, which Walker filed away as probably coincidental and possibly not. Master Chief, Donovan said, and his voice had the particular calibration of someone who was confident in his authority and wanted that confidence to do work before the actual conversation started. We have information that an individual currently on federal watch status may have accessed this facility within the past several hours. I'm here to take custody of that individual and any associated materials. What individual? Walker said. The name on the watch status is classified, Donovan said. But I'm authorized to inform you that this relates to an active federal investigation and that your cooperation is required under federal statute. Walker looked at him steadily. In Walker's many years of experience dealing with authority, in various configurations, he had developed a reliable internal instrument for distinguishing between authority being exercised legitimately and authority being performed. The performance of authority was usually smoother than the real thing. It came in prepackaged sentences. It invoked statute by number without being asked. It tried to move quickly past the point where questions could be inserted. Donovan was performing authority. I appreciate you coming out here personally, Walker said in a tone that was perfectly professional and communicated absolutely nothing useful about what he intended to do next. I'll need to verify your credentials through my chain of command before I can authorize access to facility personnel. That's standard procedure on a classified evaluation installation. I'm sure you understand. Donovan's professional, neutral tightened very slightly. Not a dramatic shift, a compression at the corners of the mouth, a fractional hardening of the eyes. The micro-expression of someone whose script had just encountered an improvised line. This is a time-sensitive federal matter, Master Chief. My chain of command verification process takes approximately 45 minutes, Walker said. Coffee is available in the visitor reception area if you'd like to wait. The third man, still at the rear of the vehicle, shifted his weight. Reed noticed. The shift in Reed's posture was minimal, but Walker caught it in his peripheral vision and understood that Reed had read the third man's movement the same way he had. I want to be very clear, Donovan said, and some of the smoothness had left his voice now, which was in itself informative. That obstructing a federal investigation carries significant consequences for the obstructing party regardless of military rank. And I want to be very clear, Walker said, keeping his voice at exactly the same professional register he'd been using throughout, that admitting unverified personnel to a classified military installation carries significant consequences for the installation commander who authorizes the admission. I'm sure we both understand our respective positions. Donovan looked at him. Walker looked at Donovan. Behind Walker inside the facility, Michael Morgan was in the communications room with Hailey beside him and Chen running the secure channel as fast as the system would allow. The documentation was moving. Compressed encrypted traveling through a channel that the people in the SUV outside almost certainly didn't know about and couldn't intercept if they did toward custodians who had been waiting for exactly this transmission. The clock was the variable. It was always the clock. Walker needed 20 more minutes, at minimum. I'm going to ask you to wait in the visitor area, Walker said to Donovan. My aide will escort you. Donovan did not move. Master Chief, he said, and the professional neutral was largely gone now. I know who is in this facility. I know why they came here, and I know what they brought with them. And I am telling you as clearly as I can tell you that what you are doing right now has consequences that extend well beyond this installation and well beyond your career. Walker held his gaze. Mr. Donovan, he said, and his voice was the voice he used when he had run out of patience for a conversation and was moving it to its conclusion. I've been in situations where someone told me that my actions would have significant consequences. In my experience, when someone says that before anything has actually happened, they're usually describing what they plan to do rather than what I've already done. So with respect, I'll manage my own consequences. He looked at the man evenly. My aide will show you to the visitor area. You're welcome to call your supervisors while you wait. I'll have verification completed as quickly as I can. He turned and nodded to Chen, who had appeared in the entrance at exactly the right moment, which was not accidental, because Chen operated at a level of situational awareness that Walker had stopped taking for granted years ago. Donovan did not follow Chen. He stood at the entrance and he made a calculation. Walker could see it happening. The man was adding up what he'd seen. The evaluation team's positioning Walker's manner, the facility's communication infrastructure, the 45-minute delay that was actually a very specific time request in arriving at an understanding of the situation that was accurate enough to make his next decision difficult. If Morgan was already transmitting forcible entry into a military facility, to stop it would create a record that was worse than the record they were trying to suppress, especially with a federal response team already in transit. Donovan put his badge away. He looked at Walker one final time, and in that look was something that Walker categorized carefully and stored. Not anger, not frustration. The specific look of someone who understood that a gamble had come up short and who was already beginning to calculate the next one. We'll wait, Donovan said. Walker nodded. He walked back into the facility and did not let the walk become hurried until he was through the inner door and out of the camera angle from the exterior. Then he moved. In the communications room, Morgan was watching Chen's screen as the transmission progress bar crossed 68%. Hailey was standing behind her father with her hand on the back of his chair, not gripping it, just there. Present. The way she'd stood at that gatepost needing contact with something solid. Walker came in. How long? He said. 7 minutes, Chen said without looking up from the screen. We have 7 minutes, Walker told Morgan. Morgan looked at the screen. He looked at Walker. Did they come in? They're waiting, Walker said. But they won't wait indefinitely. When the transmission completes, I need you to go on record immediately. On camera, on a secure federal channel with your identity confirmed. Once your testimony is attached to the documentation in a live federal record, they have no legal basis for custody that would survive judicial review. I know, Morgan said. I've been building toward that for 3 years. I know you have, Walker said. 4 minutes now. The room counted down in the particular silence of people who were focused on a single variable and had nothing to add to it. The transmission bar moved across the screen in increments that felt slower than they were because the attention in the room was so concentrated. 82%, 91, 97. And then Chen said quietly and with a steadiness that she would probably not fully feel until the following morning, complete. Morgan exhaled. Hailey's hand on the back of his chair pressed once briefly and released. Walker picked up the secure line and looked at Morgan. Ready, I hear, he said. Morgan stood up, he straightened, and Walker watched the man he had known before 3 years of a story that shouldn't have existed organize himself back into the shape of someone who was going to say difficult, true things on record in front of the people with authority over what happened next. Ready, Morgan said. Walker dialed. The testimony lasted 22 minutes. When it was done, Walker sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds, which was his version of a lengthy emotional response. Then he picked up the radio. Read it, he said. Tell our federal visitors that their identification has been verified and their visit has been logged. Tell them that the individual they were seeking is now in federal protective custody under the direct authorization of Admiral Corrigan's office. And tell them that any further action regarding this facility or its personnel should be directed to that office. A pause. Then Reed's voice, and it carried something Walker had not heard in it before. Something that sounded underneath the professional delivery like the particular satisfaction of a person who has been part of something that mattered. Copy that, Master Chief, Reed said. With pleasure. Walker set the radio down. He looked across the desk at Michael Morgan, who was sitting with the stillness of someone who had just completed something that had been the entire project of a very long and very difficult period of his life, and was now in the first moments of the world that came after it. And then Walker looked at Hailey. She was standing by the window. She was not celebrating. She was not collapsing with relief or breaking into the emotional release that the previous 3 years would have justified completely. She was standing by the window and looking out at the Nevada desert, and her face had the expression of someone who has crossed a distance that required everything they had and is now standing on the other side of it and is only beginning to understand what it cost. Walker said nothing. Some moments needed to be left alone. But Michael Morgan turned in his chair to look at his daughter. Hailey, he said. She turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 years of looking from a distance that didn't allow for this, for the specific information that proximity to a person you loved provided the small changes and the larger ones, the evidence of who they had been becoming while you were unable to be present for it. You didn't wait, he said. It was not criticism. It was the opposite of criticism. It was a father looking at the person his child had become and recognizing in them the things he had tried to teach them and something beyond what he tried to teach them, something they had derived at on their own in the space his absence had created. You taught me not to, she said. Morgan looked at her, then he looked at Walker. Walker was already looking at both of them with the expression of a man who had spent his career making assessments and who was in this particular moment making one that he was going to carry for a long time. He had seen what this girl had done in less than 24 hours. He had seen her walk into a room of laughter and respond with 5 quiet words. He had seen her perform on a range in conditions that should have been beyond her and perform at a level that had reordered his understanding of what natural ability, combined with the right teaching, could produce. He had seen her read a security situation and find the non-standard solution while professionals were still reaching for standard ones. He had seen her stand at a communications room doorway while her father's future transmitted across an encrypted channel and be still and be ready and be exactly what the moment needed without being asked. He had seen all of that, and he was 51 years old, and he had been doing this for a long time, and he knew what he was looking at. He was looking at something that was going to matter for a long time to a lot of people. Outside the facility, the dark SUV was backing down the access road in the direction it had come from. Donovan and his people were leaving. The decision in the car was probably a difficult one, the calculation of next moves and damage control, and what the transmission's arrival at federal level meant for the structure they'd been maintaining. Those calculations were not Walker's problem. His problem had been this facility and these people in this night, and that problem was resolving. Reed watched the SUV's taillights disappear down the road, and he stood at the gate in the Nevada desert on Christmas afternoon, and he thought about a 17-year-old girl who had shown up the previous evening in a truck that shouldn't still be running, and about a dead man who had walked out of the desert through a gate that opened because a man who had known him chose to trust what his eyes told him. He thought about Station 7, two simultaneous targets, the non-standard solution, the option that only existed if you were patient enough to look longer before you decided what the problem was. Reed turned and walked back toward the facility. He had a feeling the evaluation report he was going to be asked to contribute to was going to be unlike any evaluation report he had contributed to before. He was right about that. 4 vehicles, 12 personnel, federal protective detail with documentation that cleared every checkpoint in under 90 seconds, which told Walker everything he needed to know about how seriously Corrigan had taken the phone call and how quickly the Admiral had moved once he understood what was sitting in a small office in the Nevada desert waiting for him. Walker met the team lead at the main entrance, Captain Elaine Sorrell, late 30s, the kind of person who moved through space like she'd already mapped every exit and entry point before she walked through the door. She shook Walker's hand, once firm and brief, and looked at him with eyes that had already done their assessment and filed their conclusion. "Master Chief Walker," she said, "Admiral Corrigan sends his compliments and his apologies for the timeline." 4 hours is fast," Walker said. "He said to tell you it should have been faster," Sorrell said, "and that he owes you a conversation." Walker nodded once. "Morgan is in the secure communications room. He's been on record since 1432. Documentation has been confirmed received at 3 separate federal intake points." Sorrell's expression didn't change, but something behind it settled, the way things settled when a worst-case scenario was definitively off the table. "And the federal visitors you logged at 1409 departed at 1451, Walker said. "We have full documentation of their arrival credentials presented and departure. It's clean." "Good," she said. And then in a tone that was slightly outside the professional register she'd been using, "We've been trying to find Michael Morgan for 8 months, Master Chief. The official investigation. Not the one that buried him. The other one." She looked at him steadily. "Whoever got him here to this facility in this way did something we couldn't do with considerably more resources." Walker looked at her. "It wasn't me," he said. Sorrell looked past him toward the interior of the facility, toward the corridor that led to the communications room, toward wherever in this building a 17-year-old girl was currently sitting beside her father after 3 years of looking for him. "I know," Sorrell said. She walked inside. Walker stood in the entrance for a moment after she passed. The desert behind him had gone into its early evening register, the temperature already dropping in the direct and unambiguous way it dropped out here when the sun began to lose its angle. He had been awake since before 5 in the morning. He had managed a federal confrontation, a 22-year dead case resurrection, and an evaluation that had started as Christmas Eve duty and become something that was going to require a report unlike anything in his 11 years of instructing. One was tired in the specific way that people got tired when they had been operating at high intensity for an extended period, and the situation had finally resolved enough to let the body report in with its honest accounting. He went inside. The communications room had too many people in it for its size. Sorrell's team had distributed themselves through the space with the efficiency of people who did this routinely, and Michael Morgan was in the center of it, speaking with 2 members of the federal team, with the focused clarity of a man who had been preparing this conversation for 3 years and was not going to waste it now that it was finally happening. Hailey was not in the communications room. Walker noticed that immediately. He looked at Chen, who tilted her head slightly toward the corridor. He found Hailey in the narrow hallway outside the communications room, sitting against the wall, with her knees up and her back straight and her hands resting in her lap. Not slumped, not collapsed with relief, sitting the way she did everything with the posture of someone who was fully present in their own body and had not developed the habit of abandoning it when things got difficult. She looked up when she heard him coming. Walker sat down against the opposite wall. He was a 51-year-old military man sitting on a corridor floor on Christmas evening, and he was aware of how that looked and did not particularly care because the person across from him had earned this conversation, and it was not the kind of conversation you had standing over someone. They sat in silence for a moment. "He's okay," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something she was saying out loud to hear it in the world outside her own head. "He's okay," Walker confirmed. She looked at the wall above him. Her jaw worked once very slightly, the only visible sign of something large moving through her that she was managing by the same discipline she brought to everything else. 3 years, she said. "Yes," Walker said. "I knew he was alive," she said. "I knew it the way you know things that don't have evidence yet. People kept telling me to accept it. The flag, the letter, the number I called." Her voice was even, but the evenness was load-bearing the way a structure was, even when it was holding something heavy. "The person on the phone when I called that number told me that grieving was a process and that it was important to allow myself to move through it. I said I wasn't going to grieve for someone who wasn't dead. They told me that was a natural response and that I should consider speaking with a counselor." Walker said nothing. "I was 14 when he disappeared," she said. 14 years old, and someone was telling me to accept a flag and move on. Walker let the weight of that sit in the corridor between them without trying to address it or soften it, because some things didn't need addressing, and the attempt to soften them was its own kind of disrespect. "What did you do?" he said. "After the phone call, what was the first thing you did?" She looked at him. "I went to the range," she said, "the one my father and I used. Outside our property, I shot until I couldn't see the targets anymore. Not because I was angry, because I needed to do something my hands knew how to do while the rest of me figured out what came next." Walker understood that. He understood it in the specific way that people understood things they had also done, not versions of it, the actual thing. "And then what came next," he said. "I started building the case," she said, simply, without drama. "I didn't have access to what my father had. I didn't have the documentation or the operational knowledge. But I knew my father well enough to know how he thought. I knew the way he moved through problems. I knew that if he was alive, he was building something. And if he was building something, there would eventually be a moment where he needed someone to be in a specific place." She paused. "I made myself into someone who could be useful in that place when the moment came." Walker looked at her. "You spent 3 years preparing for a single operation," he said. "I spent 3 years making sure I wouldn't be a liability when my father needed me," she said. "There's a difference." There was a difference. Walker sat with it. "He knew you were doing it," Walker said. It was not a question. He had seen the way Michael Morgan looked at his daughter in that office, the specific quality of that inventory. "We both knew," she said. "We were working toward the same point from different distances. We just couldn't say so." Something moved in her face. Brief, controlled. "There are a lot of things we couldn't say for 3 years." Walker looked at her for a long moment. "You came here not just to find him," he said slowly, working it out as he said it. "You came here because he needed you here, because the operation required someone who could get through the evaluation, get access to me and establish credibility fast enough that I would actually listen when you put the photograph on the desk." "Yes," she said. "If you hadn't performed the way you did on the range last night, I would have read the photograph differently," Walker said. "I would have been sympathetic. I would have made the appropriate referrals, but I would not have made the phone call I made, and I would not have gone to the perimeter gate when the credential activated." "Yes," she said again. "The evaluation was part of the operation," Walker said. She met his eyes. "Everything was part of the operation," she said. "The truck that looked like it was about to fall apart. The worn duffel bag. Arriving on Christmas Eve when the facility was running a minimal rotation. Shooting last after the veterans had established the baseline so that what I did would land against a comparison." She said it without any trace of manipulation smugness. It was the recitation of a plan, not the performance of one. "My father taught me that the best operations were the ones where every element served more than one purpose. The evaluation was real. The performance was real. But the context was constructed." Walker sat with that for several seconds. He thought about Sergeant Donovan throwing the file across the room in the briefing. He thought about the laughter and the jokes and the 5 quiet words that had replaced all of it. He thought about the men on the range watching a 17-year-old girl work through 9 stations in conditions that were supposed to sort the serious from the rest, and the silence that had followed her off the course. I thought about Reed at the coffee station that morning pushing a cup toward her without being asked. He thought about Watts at Station 7, standing with his hands in his pockets and his mouth slightly open, running the same problem in his mind and arriving at a different answer than the one she'd found. Did your father know what the laughter would be like? Walker said. In the briefing room, when you walked in. Something passed very briefly through her expression. Not quite amusement, something older than amusement. He said it was likely, she said. He said that the expectation of what I would be was the most useful tool I'd have in the first hour. Walker exhaled slowly. He was right, Walker said. He usually is, she said. And this time there was something in her voice that was not quite amusement, but was something warmer than everything that had preceded it, the specific warmth of a daughter who had carried her father in his absence and was now beginning to process the fact that the carrying was over. Walker stood up. His knees registered the floor with the honest discomfort of a man who was not 23 anymore and had just sat on a corridor floor for longer than was comfortable. I extended his hand. Hailey looked at it for a moment. Then she took it and stood. Come on, he said, and your father's going to want you in the room for the next part. And frankly, given everything, I think you've more than earned the seat at the table. She walked with him back to the communications room. The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that happened inside institutions when the machinery of accountability was asked to process something it had been avoiding for a long time. They were not dramatic hours in the way that the preceding hours had been. They were the hours of documentation and testimony and formal record, and the careful, deliberate work of people who understood that the truth to matter had to be established in a form that could not be unmade by the same forces that had buried it the first time. Morgan gave his testimony again, this time on record to Sorrell's team, with full federal intake protocols, and the testimony was the same testimony he'd given on the secure line to Corrigan's office earlier, consistent in every detail, supported by the documentation now in federal custody at 3 separate locations. Walker gave his own account, the evaluation, the arrival, the photograph, the conversation, the credential activation, the federal visitors and their departure. He gave it clearly and completely without editorializing in the tone of a man who had spent his career giving accurate accounts of difficult situations and understood that accuracy was the only version worth giving. Reed and Watts gave accounts of what they had witnessed on the range and at the perimeter. Chin gave an account of the security monitoring the alert and the communications protocols she had run throughout the afternoon. Briggs gave an account of the gate. He was 23 years old and he gave it steadily and accurately and without flinching from the part where he had been told by the master chief of a classified evaluation facility that he had not seen anything at that gate in a 15-minute window, and he had confirmed his understanding of that instruction. He gave that part of the account the same way he gave the rest of it, clearly, completely. Sorrell looked at him when he finished and said, Specialist Briggs, I want you to know that what you did at that gate this afternoon and how you've accounted for it just now reflects a quality of judgment that your commanding officer should be aware of. She glanced at Walker. If he isn't already, he is now, Walker said. Briggs looked at the floor for exactly 1 second. Then he looked up. His face had the expression of someone who had just received information that they were going to need time to fully process, but who was maintaining their composure with commendable discipline in the meantime. Thank you, ma'am, he said. At 1900, Sorrell gathered her team for a brief internal meeting in the conference room, and Walker stepped out to the main corridor and stood with Reed and Watts in the particular comfortable silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it to each other. Reed spoke first. The evaluation report, he said. What are you going to put in it? Walker looked at him. The truth, Walker said, which is that this candidate performed at a level that I have not previously encountered in 11 years of evaluation at this facility or anywhere prior to it under conditions that were designed to expose weakness and demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but tactical intelligence and real-time problem-solving capacity that exceeded what the evaluation was designed to measure. Reed was quiet for a moment. She's 17, Watts said. It was not the dismissal it would have been 36 hours ago in the briefing room. It was a statement of fact offered in a tone of pure bewilderment. Yes, Walker said. What happens to her now, Reed said. Walker looked down the corridor toward the communications room, where through the half-open door he could see Michael Morgan seated beside his daughter. their chairs angled toward each other, speaking in the low voices of people who had a great deal of catching up to do and had finally been given the space to do it. That depends on a great deal of things that are going to be decided in offices considerably more senior than mine, Walker said. But I intend to make my recommendation very clear in that report. Which is, Watts said. Walker looked at him. That whatever pathway this country has for developing the kind of ability she has, she belongs on it, formally, with full institutional support and full institutional recognition. He paused. And that the institutional support should arrive before someone else recognizes what she is and makes a different kind of offer. The last part landed with the weight it deserved. Reed and Watts both understood it. In a world where the particular combination of abilities Hailey Morgan possessed had just been demonstrated in front of federal personnel and evaluation teams and security records, the window in which her future could be shaped by people who had her interests at the center of their consideration was not unlimited. I'll back the report, Reed said. So will I, Watts said. Walker nodded once. The three of them stood in the corridor a moment longer. Then Reed said something that came out quieter than he intended and more honest than he'd planned, the way things sometimes did when a person was tired and the professional guard was at a slightly lower setting than usual. I laughed at her, he said, in the briefing room when she walked in. Walker looked at him. I know, Walker said. I want that in the record somewhere, Reed said. Not officially, but somewhere, that I was one of the people who laughed and I was wrong before she said a single word, and by the end of the night on the range, I was watching her like she was teaching me something. Watts looked at the floor with the expression of a man who was having the same internal conversation and not yet deciding whether to have it out loud. Walker looked at Reed. It's already in the record, Walker said. The part where you pushed a coffee cup toward her at 5:55 in the morning without being asked. The part where you said, well, after Station 9 and meant everything by it. Records aren't only what gets filed in official reports. He held Reed's gaze. You adjusted. That matters. Reed absorbed that. Then he did the thing Walker had only seen him do once before, the brief, surprised smile that happened when his face made a decision before his mind caught up to it. He walked away down the corridor. Watts followed. Walker stood alone for a moment. He looked toward the communications room. And then something happened that he had not been expecting, because the past 48 hours had been full of things he had not been expecting, and apparently that pattern was going to continue until this night was fully done. The door to the communications room opened fully, and Michael Morgan came out. He walked to where Walker was standing, and he stopped, and the two men looked at each other in the corridor of a facility in the Nevada desert on Christmas evening, and 20 years of shared history and 3 years of interrupted history occupied the space between them without needing to be described. Daniel, Morgan said. Michael, Walker said. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Morgan looked at the floor, then up. I know what opening that gate cost you, the risk you took on incomplete information, the position you put yourself in by not following protocol when the federal team arrived. He looked at Walker directly. I know what that kind of decision cost a person in this career, and I know you knew the cost when you made it. I knew you, Walker said. That was enough information. Morgan exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carried something that had been held in the chest for longer than a breath's worth of time. There were days in the last 3 years, he said, and his voice had a different quality, now the quality of a man accessing something that lived underneath the operational competence and the discipline in the 3 years of careful, constructed survival. When I wasn't sure the case would hold, when the whole architecture of what I was building felt like something that would collapse before it could be used. When I couldn't see Hailey and I couldn't make contact and I didn't know if she was all right, and the distance between where I was and where she was felt like something that was going to break something permanent in both of us. Walker was quiet. On those days, Morgan continued, I thought about specific people I trusted with the absolute rather than the conditional trust. The list was short. He looked at Walker. You were on it. Walker held his gaze. I'm glad you're alive, Walker said, and the sentence came out simpler and more direct than he'd intended, and exactly right because of it. Morgan nodded. Once. Then he put his hand briefly on Walker's shoulder, the same brief firm contact that Walker had pressed against the doorframe of room 12 the previous night, the physical acknowledgement that language was handling imprecisely. Then he went back into the communications room. Walker stood in the corridor. I was 51 years old, and he had been in this career for a long time, and he had accumulated across that time a particular kind of knowledge that came from sustained proximity to people doing difficult things under genuine pressure. He knew what people were made of when the pressure was real. He could read it. He had learned to read it the same way Hailey had learned to read the wind, not computationally, not from a manual, but from long practice and deep attention. He knew what Michael Morgan was made of. He had just spent 36 hours discovering what his daughter was made of. And standing in the corridor of Ridgecrest on Christmas evening, Walker understood something that he was going to spend considerable time with in the days ahead. The thing that Hailey Morgan represented was not a prodigy in the way that word usually worked, not a freak occurrence, not an outlier that defied categorization. She was the result of a specific kind of teaching from a specific kind of person teaching that had been tested by the most difficult possible conditions, the 3-year absence of the teacher, and had held. She had learned not just the skills, but the philosophy behind the skills, not just the techniques, but the principles that generated the techniques. Her father hadn't given her answers. He had given her the capacity to find answers in situations the answers had never been taught for. And she had used that capacity in a way that had moved a 3-year dead case into federal protective custody on Christmas Day and put the names behind it into a federal record that was not going to be quietly absorbed by the institutional machinery that had protected them. She had done that at 17 years old. Walker shook his head once very slightly, the gesture of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Then he went to write the report. He sat at his desk for 2 hours. He wrote the evaluation the way he wrote everything that mattered, with precision and without inflation, because he had been in this long enough to know that inflation undermined credibility and precision was its own argument. He documented the range performance with the data. He documented the Station 7 solution. He documented the tactical assessment she had offered during the security situation. He documented the credential response timeline and her read of her father's signaling method, which had been correct. He wrote one additional section that was not standard in evaluation reports. He titled it Assessment of Candidate Character and Operational Judgment. He wrote, in 11 years of conducting advanced evaluations at this and prior facilities, I have encountered a small number of candidates whose ability exceeded the evaluation's capacity to measure it. In each prior case, that excess was technical. The evaluation could measure skill, but not the architecture behind the skill. In the case of Hailey Morgan, the excess is not only technical, it is foundational. What this candidate demonstrates is not a ceiling we haven't yet found. It is a way of thinking about problems that produces solutions at a pace and quality that the standard evaluation framework was not built to capture. He paused. Then he wrote, I recommend this candidate for immediate advancement to the next available formal training pathway with full institutional designation. I recommend this without qualification and without reservation. I have not written those 2 sentences in an evaluation report before. He signed it. He sat back. Through the window, the desert was fully dark. Now the stars in their winter configuration over the Nevada basin. The same stars that had been out when Hailey Morgan drove up to the checkpoint 22 hours ago in a truck held together by stubbornness, with a worn duffel bag and a rifle case and a photograph in the inside pocket of her jacket and 3 years of a plan in her head. Walker looked at the signed report. I thought about Sergeant Donovan throwing the file across the room and the laughter that had followed, and the moment Hailey had stood in the doorway and waited for it to stop and then said 5 words that had changed the temperature of everything. He thought about Station 7, 2 targets, non-standard solution, the option that only existed for the patient. I thought about a girl standing at the outer perimeter of this facility, gripping a fence post while a figure walked toward her through the desert, and the moment she let go and walked forward, and everything that had lived in that moment. I thought about experience creating knowledge and passion, creating legends, and whether the 2 things were actually separate or whether the greatest practitioners were the ones who understood that you needed both. That knowledge without passion was a library nobody visited, and passion without knowledge was a fire with no structure to carry it. I thought about a 17-year-old girl who had walked into this desert as someone nobody expected anything from, and had walked out before the night was over as someone nobody who had seen her would ever forget. He picked up the report. I was going to deliver it to Sorrell's team tonight. He wanted it in the formal record before morning, in the same federal intake that held Michael Morgan's testimony, in the same protected architecture, that could not be quietly absorbed or selectively redacted by the people who had a motivation to absorb and redact it. He wanted Hailey Morgan's name in that record the way her father's name was in it, permanently, officially, undeniably. He stood up. And before he left his office, he picked up the thin manila folder that had started all of this, the file with more redactions than information, the document that had seemed to him 2 days ago like the thinnest evaluation authorization he had ever received. He looked at the name on it, Morgan Hailey. He set it down. He walked to the communications room. Sorrel was wrapping the final procedural elements with her team. Morgan was speaking with two of the federal intake officers. His posture, the posture of a man who was tired in the bone-deep way that 3 years of sustained operation eventually produced, and who was allowing himself, perhaps, for the first time in those 3 years, to let the tiredness show because the operation was complete and the documentation was in, and he was in a room full of people who were on the correct side of the information. Hailey was at the corner of the room. She was watching her father, not with the anxious attention of someone monitoring a fragile situation, with the settled attention of someone who had what they came for and were in the early stage of understanding what it meant to have it. There was something in her face that Walker had not seen in it before, not in the briefing room, or on the range, or in his office, or in the corridor, or at the gate. Something that lived underneath all the discipline and the composure and the 5 quiet words: directness, relief. Real, unguarded, unperformed relief. The kind that came when something you had been holding for so long that you'd stopped fully registering the weight of it had finally actually been set down. She looked like someone whose hands had just been freed after 3 years of carrying something heavy, and whose hands didn't quite know what to do with being empty yet, and who was just beginning to discover that empty hands were not a problem. They were an opening. Walker crossed the room and stood beside her. She looked up at him. "The report is done," he said quietly. "It goes into the federal record tonight with everything else." She looked at him. "What did you write?" she said. "The truth," he said, "which is that you are the most remarkable candidate I have evaluated in 11 years of doing this job, and that I am recommending you for immediate advancement without qualification or reservation." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the first time anyone in an official capacity has said something like that to me," she said. "It won't be the last," Walker said. She looked at her father across the room. "He's going to need time," she said. "Before anything else, he's been running for 3 years, and now that it's over, people need time when things are over." "Yes," Walker said. "I do too," she said, not apologetically, informatively. The statement of someone who knew themselves clearly. "You have it," Walker said. "Whatever the next steps are in terms of formal pathways and institutional decisions, those conversations don't happen tonight. Tonight is for this." He looked at Morgan. "And for that." She nodded, and then she said something that Walker didn't expect, not because it was dramatic, but because of the direction it came from, the angle of the statement, the specific thing she had chosen to say out of everything she could have said in this moment. "Sergeant Donovan," she said, "the one who threw the file, from last night." Walker looked at her. "He was wrong," she said, "but not about everything. I was 17. I was a girl. I hadn't been through any formal program. From the outside, everything he saw was an accurate description of what he was looking at." She paused. "He was wrong about what that meant, but he wasn't wrong about the facts." Walker waited. "I want to understand that," she said. "The difference between the facts and what the facts mean. My father taught me to read the space between the target and the shooter. I want to spend my career learning to read the space between what something looks like and what it actually is." She looked at Walker directly. "Is that something you can teach?" Walker looked at her for a long time. For the second time since she'd arrived, then he thought about experience creating knowledge and passion, creating legends. And for the second time, he reached the same place at the end of the thought, the place where those things weren't separate categories, but two aspects of a single thing, the thing that happened when a person committed to something with their whole self and kept that commitment through conditions that would have ended the commitment for most people. He had been in this career for a long time. He had taught a great many people. He had never been asked that question before. "Yes," he said, "that's something I can teach." The words settled between them like something that had been agreed on rather than simply spoken. And in the communications room of Ridgecrest Advanced Training Facility on Christmas night, with the Nevada desert pressing its cold and its stars against the walls in the formal machinery of accountability, doing the work it had been avoiding for 3 years in a federal transport team preparing to carry Michael Morgan's truth into the institutional record, where it would live and be protected and eventually produce the consequences it deserved. A 17-year-old girl who had driven through the dark with a worn bag and a rifle case and a plan that most adults would have called impossible, looked at the man who had opened a gate for her and her father and said the only thing left to say. "Then let's get to work," she said. And Master Chief Daniel Walker, 51 years old, decorated, experienced the product of a career spent learning the difference between what things look like and what they actually were looked at. Hailey Morgan had understood with the certainty of someone who had earned the right to be certain about this, that he was looking at the beginning of something. Not a story, not a legend in the making. Something that was already what it was going to be, fully formed in the person standing in front of him, simply waiting for the world to build the space around it large enough to hold it. He had spent his career deciding who belonged. He had never been more certain of an answer. Hailey Morgan belonged. And the desert outside held its silence, and the stars held their positions, and somewhere in the vast and indifferent darkness of the Nevada night, a 17-year-old girl who had arrived as nobody and departed as someone unforgettable that stood at the exact point where a legend stopped becoming and simply was.